After America is made on the lands of the Kure Wurrung, Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. We acknowledge that they and their ancestors have cared for the lands, rivers and sea, and all living creatures for thousands of generations. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Hi, I'm Emma Shortis, and this is After America. Parliament is back here in Australia, and the news has largely been driven by international events. Another $800 million AUKUS down payment, the Australian government's decision to lift that import ban on American beef, and Israel's war and starvation of Gaza.
A 1-year-old boy is not a Hamas fighter, and the civilian casualties and death in Gaza is completely unacceptable.
It has coincided, this protest today, with a statement that was signed by 28 countries, including Australia, released overnight, calling for an immediate ceasefire once again.
The situation in Gaza is beyond the world's worst fears.
The deteriorating situation we've seen in Gaza over the last few weeks is indefensible.
Time for words is over. We need actions, and I hope that the majority Labor government that we currently see, they will sanction Israel, they'll cut ties, and they will walk the talk.
As Parliament opened, protesters stood out in the rain and read the names of 17,000 children who have been killed, though the real number is likely much higher. Inside Parliament, a number of MPs accepted a petition from Doctors Without Borders calling on the government to protect civilians in Gaza. During question time, in response to a question from independent MP Helen Haines, Defence Minister Richard Marles insisted that Australia does not supply weapons to Israel. The Australian government has signed on to a statement with 27 other countries condemning Israel for the drip-feeding of aid and inhumane killing of civilians in Gaza. But as my colleague Matt Duss has said on this show before, words are meaningless if they aren't followed up by action. The most action seems still to be reserved for those protesting the genocide.
And in this place yesterday, Senator Faruqi went a step further. She disrespected the rules of the Parliament by holding up a sign for the duration of the Governor-General's address on the opening of this term of Parliament.
Green Senator Marine Faruqi was censored for holding a sign calling for sanctions. In the United States, too, expressions of support for Palestinians also come with risks. The Trump administration has used accusations of anti-Semitism to go after students and universities. Last week, Columbia University caved and agreed to a $200 million fine in return for the restoration of federal funding, which the Trump administration had cut off. We could be forgiven for thinking that our shared values with the United States tend to bring out the worst in both of our politics. To talk about the state of politics in the US and the ongoing catastrophic failure of the Democratic Party to resist Trump, this week I'm joined by Musa Al-Gharbi. Musa is a sociologist and assistant professor in the School of Communication and Journalism at Stony Brook University. His first book, We Have Never Been Woke: The Cultural Contradictions of a New Elite, was published by Princeton University Press in October 2024. Here's Musa now. Musa, thank you so much for coming on After America.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
The pleasure is all ours. Musa, you've been out of the United States for a little while now on a book tour. I wanted to begin by asking you what it's like viewing US politics from the outside.
Yeah, it is. It is something, and in part because I was in Canada at the Summit on Democracy in Toronto, right when a lot of the tariffs were kicking in and right before the Canadian election there. Mm-hmm. And so that was surreal. It was kind of strange to be the keynote speaker at this conference when Americans and America were, at that moment, were not being held in high esteem in Canada. Like there are a lot of people who were buying Canadian as a way of avoiding the United States and so on. And then I went to the UK. I was in the UK for a few weeks and now here. One thing that I was surprised by is just how much coverage of the United States there is in other countries. I had assumed that, in the UK or in Australia or other places like this, they might have mentioned the US once or twice because, America's important, but, places have their own concerns in politics as well. But the ratio of coverage about America is much higher than I thought. And the nice thing about being in other countries, though, looking at coverage of America, is you can see the impacts of U.S. policies in a different way, right? So especially for things like the trade war, it's illuminating. I think if more Americans could see the impacts of these things from the other side of the equation, right? See how other people in other countries are experiencing this, would probably enrich a lot of Americans' understandings of kind of what's at stake in a lot of these discussions.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you're right to say that I think we are fairly fixated on what's happening in the United States. I mean, this is a podcast about what's happening in the United States and its consequences for the world. Is it as bad at home as it seems from the outside? You know, part of our fixation is because it does seem so bad. You know, what the Trump administration is doing is so appalling in so many ways.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that's interesting is when Trump was elected in 2016, there were a lot of narratives about how, hey, if this guy gets into office, it's going to be total chaos. Nothing's going to work. The economy's going to crash, blah, blah, blah. He got elected, and there wasn't actually, for up until COVID, for most Americans, they were supposed to, if they were trying to understand what the difference was between Obama and Trump, who were two very different politicians, but like the main thing they would have noticed is that people like me, people who work in the knowledge economy, going, like all day, every day for 4 years straight. But as far as their lives are concerned, not much change. The economy continued kind of on the same trajectory that it was under Obama. It continued the same way under Trump. The institutions kept on chugging along in spite of a lot of attempts that Trump made to defy norms in these institutions, were often pushed back through various legal means and kind of curtailed. And so, it was normal-ish. Especially from today's vantage point, right? But the second Trump administration is very different. It seems like the time that he has spent out of office, they've spent really organizing and planning. Part of why the first Trump administration was probably not that was not as disruptive is because Trump himself doesn't, and probably still doesn't, know much about like how systems and institutions actually function. Like, what are the levers you pull? What are the incentive structures like? Like, he didn't have a good knowledge of the institutions, and a lot of the people around him also were kind of, it was kind of a circus of people. Anyway, but this time they've spent, it seems like 4 years really deliberating, coming up with kind of detailed plans, having, very well thought out. Whether you think they're good or bad, they are clearly well thought out. Yeah. To kind of attack the institutions. And then Trump himself, his demeanor, his mentality seems to have changed. It's become even darker in some ways than it was in 2016. It seems like, however it looks from the outside, from the inside, it's probably basically that, especially if you work for the media, if you work in the bureaucracies, if you work at a university or something like that, then it's a kind of fraught and anxious moment.
Absolutely. And I mean, you work at a university, you're an academic, and they are a group of institutions that Trump is seeking vengeance on for a number of reasons. You, though, have I think a complicated relationship maybe with US universities and the Ivy Leagues. You rightly point out, I think, a deep hypocrisy on the part of those institutions that, in the first Trump administration felt pretty comfortable and pretty safe, fairly unchallenged by Trump. And that has left them open, I think, to sustained attacks by the Trump administration. How bad are those attacks, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big challenges that universities face is we have to do two things that are kind of tough to do at the same time. On the one hand, colleges and universities have to try to assert the value of their independence, try to protect their autonomy and free inquiry and things like this, and advocate for their value, why it is that, states and institutions should fund them and not defund them, for instance. On the other hand, though, there is this problem where universities face a legitimacy crisis that is in part cued, indexed to real facts and problems. So, for instance, in my book, I show that if you look at the composition of the professoriate in the United States, professors tend to be drawn from a very narrow and idiosyncratic slice of society. Huge swaths of the public are not, it's not like their imagination or misinformation or something like that. If they feel like the professoriate doesn't reflect people like them, that their values and their interests aren't represented in the academy, if they feel like academics often look down and mock and deride people like them, that's not their imagination. That does happen, and that happens a lot. That happens in a way that disturbs me, honestly. I'm at Stony Brook University. It's a public university, so I'm a civil servant. I'm paid for by tax dollars to produce a public good. And so I feel like it's incumbent on me to give a care about what the constituents, what their preferences are, what their priorities are, what their concerns are, and to speak to those in a meaningful way. We don't have to be slavish about like public opinion or anything like that. But what we do have to do is we do have to kind of recognize what our constituents care about, what they need, what they want, and try to speak to those concerns in a meaningful way. A lot of my colleagues at public universities in general, not speaking specifically at Stony Brook, but you see it sometimes there too, exhibit a kind of open disdain for what the people in the local community think and feel, for especially if they're in a red state or something like that. If they're a kind of blue little button in a red state, they often express like real disdain for the people who are making it possible for them to do the work that they do. And I view that as unacceptable. You know, there's a lot of research in the social sciences that when people feel like they don't have a voice or a stake in institutions, when they feel like people like them aren't represented in institutions, when they feel like the people who run the institutions hate people like them, the kind of natural impulse is to try to defund those institutions, to marginalize them, to mistrust them. And of course, why wouldn't you? If you really believed that an institution was hostile towards people like you, it would be suicidal to fund it, to cooperate with it, to cooperate with it towards your own demise and things like this, right? And so I think, you know, one of the challenges that universities face is that we actually don't do a very good job in many respects of reflecting the public and their concerns. We don't do a good job of speaking to ordinary people in a way that they'll find compelling and accessible about what the value of our work is, about the value that we add to society, and so on. And this creates an opportunity for some of the attacks that you see from Fox News, from some of the attacks you see from Donald Trump. And so this is why we have to walk and chew gum at the same time here.
Sure. So that analysis there of universities as institutions, you could easily translate to an analysis of US politics and political institutions more broadly. You know, that description of a campaign or a message of nothing to see here kind of encapsulates the Biden and then Harris campaign and Trump's response to it, you know, that I alone can fix it. I see the problems and I can fix them, and they're not even acknowledging the problems. Yeah. I would like to talk about the Democrats now based on, I suppose, that premise.
From yesterday's New York City mayoral primary, State Assemblyman Zoran Mamdani declared victory last night against former Governor Andrew Cuomo in the Democratic primary.
New Yorkers are hungry for a new kind of politics, a politics that puts working people first.
Mr. Mamdani proposed making it free to travel on city buses, freezing rent on rent-stabilised apartments, and increasing taxes on the city's wealthiest residents.
After your meeting on Friday, are you prepared to endorse Mamdani?
At the meeting on Friday, we agreed to reconvene with other members of the delegation and high-level community leaders in Brooklyn.
He's going to be a great mayor of New York City. I think the issues that he's campaigning on, the need to create a city that is affordable for working-class people, is exactly what has to happen in New York. In fact, that has to happen all over the country.
You mentioned you're based at Stony Brook, which is on Long Island, so I guess New York City adjacent, I suppose. New York City is a critical power centre for establishment Democrats, for, you know, the elite, I suppose, of the symbolic capitalists that you outline in your book, people like the Clintons, the Cuomos, Senator Chuck Schumer. But it's also home to some real upstarts in the Democratic Party, including AOC and now Zoran Mamdani. What do you make of Mamdani's appeal?
So Mamdani is interesting for a few reasons. One, if you look at the coalition of people that elected him during the primary, it's interesting. If you look at who Andrew Cuomo won, he won people at the very, very end of both sides of the income spectrum. So he actually performed better with poorer people in New York, and he performed well with the super, super rich. And then Mamdani basically swept all the middle categories. So the lower middle class, the middle class, the upper middle class, Mamdani pretty much swept up. As far as kind of what made him successful, I think there were two factors. One, he didn't spend a lot of time actually in this campaign talking about culture war issues. Now you can see Eric Adams and Cuomo and the New York Times and a lot of other outlets trying to pull Mamdani into culture wars. But on the campaign, he was focused pretty much on bread and butter issues, the price of rent, the price of food, things like this. In addition to his social media campaigning, where he was focused on these bread and butter issues, and he's very charming and charismatic. They're very clever and well done. And this was paired with a pretty aggressive set of public events and canvassing and things like this in New York, just knocking on doors, meeting people. Another thing that helped him, of course, is that the person he was running against was someone who left office in disgrace, having faced these investigations and who also kind of mismanaged the COVID campaign and who was largely attributed to resulting in unnecessary deaths of a lot of senior citizens in New York City and so on. Elections are always partly about people liking a candidate and then partly about compared to what, what's the alternative? And so in this case, one thing that helped Mamdani is that he was running against someone who was also a really disgraced, unattractive option, especially among Democratic voters. Now, in the general election, we'll have to see. So it'll be an interesting race. Who knows how it's going to shake out.
Interesting is the word. And I think, even establishment Democrats have engaged in that attempt, to draw him into the culture war. They do seem rattled, particularly by his success, to the point where Senator Kirsten Gillibrand had to apologise for some absolutely appalling comments that she made. Do you think this is almost a kind of microcosm of the ideological gap between the establishment elite of the Democratic Party and the base? What do you make of what's happening within the party?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's interesting that I showed after the election, I wrote this essay on my Substack that went viralish called "A Graveyard of Bad Election Narratives." And one of the things that I show that's I guess most important and relevant here is that when you look at not just this election, but actually the midterms and general elections since 2010, so for the last 15 years, you can see that Democrats have seen consistent losses with working class and less affluent voters, racial and ethnic minority voters, with religious voters across the board. So not just Christians, but Muslims, Jewish people. And this was before, October 7th, right? So a lot of Muslim voters and Arabs and so on were highly dissatisfied with the Biden administration's posture on Middle East politics since 2023. But even in 2020, the biggest shift, if you look at the religious vote that you saw across religious groups, was Muslims gravitating towards the Republican Party in 2020. So before any of this. And so a lot of narratives about why these realignments are happening are focused on Trump, but it's actually less about, I think, Trump or the Republican Party or any messaging the Republicans are doing, the unique characteristics of Trump. I think it seems to be driven more by alienation from the Democratic Party among a lot of working class, non-white, ethnic minority, religious minority voters and so on are going increasingly alienated from the Democratic Party. And this predates Trump, and it will probably continue after him if nothing changes. One of the things that the Democratic Party has struggled with a little bit, they have a traditional base of working class people, ethnic minorities, things like this that have long been important to the Democratic coalition. But then they also have this other block that they arguably care more about or have cared more about over the last decade. And you can see this in the candidates they field, in the Democratic Party platform positions and so on, which is highly educated white-collar professionals. And they're a prized constituency for the Democrats for a number of reasons, because they vote at higher levels than other people. They donate at higher levels than other people. They're more likely to do things like volunteer, canvassing door to door. They're more likely to do things like write letters and petitions to their senators to complain about things that they disagree on. And so for a while, the Democrats have operated under the calculus that getting one of these voters, even if you lose multiple other voters from other demographics, it's worth it to lose 3 normie voters who vote less regularly, donate less regularly, and so on to get one of these voters, worth the trade. The problem is that's only worth a trade up to a point, and then you start having an unworkable coalition. And this is especially true because these knowledge economy professionals, symbolic capitalists, we tend to be consolidated in a small and shrinking number of states and cities that are already decisively blue, whereas these other voters are even more, they're dispersed around the country. And so it's actually difficult, and it's growing increasingly difficult to win the Electoral College or to win the Senate when you have a party that's just too focused on these professionals. And it's tough to have a coalition that includes both the working class folks and the professionals in part, because they actually have very different approaches to politics, very different sensibilities with respect to a lot of contentious moral and social issues. It's not even necessarily that they disagree on some of these issues. So for instance, one narrative you hear in kind of popularist spaces in the US is that if you want to win working class voters, what you have to do is you have to throw all the groups under the bus. You have to throw, and that's not true. So there's this great study by Jacobin called Common Sense Solidarity. And what they found was that it's actually not the case that working class voters are hostile towards environmentalism, for instance. They often do care about the environment. They often suffer actually from environmental devastation, pollution, things like this. It's not the case that they're unsympathetic towards, they don't care about LGBTQ people and their struggles. It's not the case that they don't care about racial inequality or gender inequality. The thing is, though, for a lot of working class voters, to the extent that they care about these issues, they prefer that people talk about social problems as much as they can in ways that are that appeal to shared goals, common values, superordinate identities. So you're a Muslim, I'm a Christian, we're both Americans, kind of what we have in common instead of what divides us. And they prefer kind of universalistic policies as much as possible. So they would prefer things that help poor people writ large rather than poor people who happen to be Black get one set of benefits, poor people who happen to be white get a different set of benefits. Like they prefer more universalistic policies that helped people who are suffering regardless of these characteristics. And the thing is, like to the extent that, say, African Americans are disproportionately likely to be poor, you can still have a policy that disproportionately benefits African Americans by helping the poor. It's just you wouldn't necessarily foreground that in the messaging that this is a program intended to benefit this particular, right? And so you can design social policies that address and try to mitigate a lot of these challenges. It's more about the framing. But the problem is a lot of white collar professionals, if you design a policy, even if it's a policy that disproportionately helps minorities, if you don't frame it that way, if you don't frame it in terms of this is a policy designed to combat racialized inequalities, we're doing it for Black people, then there's kind of a perception among us that you're not being real or that you're not like confronting the real issue or something like this. And so we tend to be highly dissatisfied with that kind of a policy or messaging. We often put pressure on lawmakers to instead speak directly on race and gender and sexuality. And they listen to us because, again, we're a prized constituency. And so we end up with messaging and stuff that often doesn't resonate. But people sometimes take the wrong lesson from it, which is that working class people hate gays, they don't care about the environment. That's just not true.
I believe in what we can do together that is about sustaining America's standing in the world and ensuring that we have the respect that we so rightly deserve, including respecting our military and ensuring we have the most lethal fighting force in the world.
I know the last 5 months have been gut-wrenching for so many people, for the Israeli people, for the Palestinian people, and so many here in America. This crisis began on October 7th with a massacre by a terrorist group called Hamas, as you all know.
This year has been difficult, given the scale of death and destruction in Gaza, and given the civilian casualties and displacement in Lebanon. It is devastating. And as president, I will do everything in my power to end the war in Gaza.
I think one of the most striking examples of both the kind of alienation that you were talking about and of establishment Democrats seeking to speak only to a certain kind of person was Kamala Harris's embrace of the endorsement of Liz Cheney for example. The pursuit of the Cheneys and those campaign events where, 100 Republicans were lined up behind a candidate and there was so much made of that endorsement. And the question on my mind then was always, who is this for? Who is this appealing to? And I think it seemed, at least from the outside, to only further ingrain that kind of alienation. And it was deeply connected, I think, to that, refusal to listen, particularly to working class Americans, not just about the kinds of issues that you're talking about, economic inequality, for example, but about the United States' role in the world as well, and particularly about the United States' role in the forever wars. Yeah. You have very personal experience with this. How important do you think was Trump's ability to frame himself as the anti-war candidate, the guy who was going to get the United States out of the forever wars, compared to Harris's promise that she would make the United States military the most lethal in the world, her refusal to engage on issues around Gaza? How important was that failure to Trump's victory?
Yeah, I think in both cycles that Trump won, this was important. So in 2016, Hillary Clinton was one of the most hawkish candidates in either party. Like, her main critique was that Obama wasn't aggressive enough and interventionist enough in the Middle East. She wanted to do regime change in Syria. She wanted to do a much more aggressive boots on the ground sort of stuff in Ukraine, and so on and so forth. And there was a study that was done after the election that showed that, for instance, if you looked at some of the places that shifted most towards Trump in 2016 from compared to 2012, there were places that knew loss from war, places that had large concentrations of people who were deployed, whose children, loved ones, and so on were deployed to the Middle East and saw casualties. Those are some of the places that shifted the most towards Donald Trump in 2016. And in 2024, we see a similar kind of thing. So the conflict between Russia and Ukraine had been going on for pretty much the entirety of the Biden administration's tenure. They didn't seem to really have a plan to bring that to a close in any meaningful way. They were trying to manage the conflict rather than end it. And with respect to Israel and Gaza, one of the things that's striking here is that the U.S. has a lot of leverage over Israel and Israeli policy. You can see a lot of Israeli foreign ministers, if you read the Times of Israel, Haaretz, things like this, they often say, look, if the U.S. wasn't underwriting us, wasn't providing these arms, we couldn't conduct the war. Period. We couldn't. And U.S. leaders in the past have, in fact, exercised leverage. So, for instance, to stick with Republicans, Ronald Reagan, when Israel invaded Lebanon during the Reagan administration in the aftermath of the barracks bombings at that. So this was after the U.S. had lost a lot of people. And then, but Israel was carrying out this bombing campaign in Lebanon. And it had done a ground invasion. Ronald Reagan saw some of the images of the destruction in Lebanon and the people who were being killed in Lebanon. And he compared it to a Holocaust. He used that word. And he said, it stops. It's ending. And they pulled back. Because, of course, the U.S. has the ability to make that kind of a declaration. They actually couldn't continue. And so the Biden administration, though, spent the whole time kind of wringing its hands about how sad civilian casualties were, kind of providing cover for a lot of crimes that were like war crimes and stuff. And the tension, of course, is that in the aftermath of the horrific atrocities that were carried out in Israel on October 7th, some kind of response was necessary, was probably necessary on the Israeli side. It was and was inevitable in any case. There was going to be a response.
Always.
But when the response comes to the point of just killing overwhelming numbers of civilians, just flattening, in a way, carrying out this campaign of destruction of civilian infrastructure that really doesn't have any parallel since the World War II, and then it starts spreading into invasions and occupations of Lebanon, invasions and occupations of Syria, carrying out terrorist attacks in Iran, and then later bombing Iran, carrying out campaigns in Yemen. And it's like spreading into all these other countries. And it's kind of, and the Biden administration's posture is, that's so terrible. It's bad. Oh, someone should do something about that, right? Drawing red lines. And then when the red lines are crossed, the weapons keep flowing. This was a source of frustration for a lot of Americans. It seemed to feel for a lot of Americans that the situation was out of control. It was going out of control, And there was this adult old man in the driver's seat who didn't seem like he was able to exert any kind of control over the situation. And we seem to be careening towards World War III. So I think there is a way in which the kind of Biden administration foreign policy, combined with these kind of concerns people had about Biden's age, created an opening for Trump. So what a lot of Americans needed was some sense of direction, a firm hand. And Kamala Harris exacerbated her posture on a lot of these foreign policy issues, exacerbated these concerns. Her position was basically that she was going to continue the policies of the Biden administration. She had her surrogates like Bill Clinton go to places like Michigan.
But when I read that people in Michigan are thinking about not voting because they're mad at the Biden administration for honoring its historic obligation to try to keep Israel from being destroyed, I think that's a mistake, because Donald Trump has shown what he wants.
This was a mistake on so many levels. Michigan was an area that had suffered some of the most significant impacts of Bill Clinton's free trade policies, like with NAFTA and stuff. So to have NAFTA king, Bill Clinton, go to Michigan and then lecture, like literally condescendingly lecture Arab and Muslim voters, saying, look, Harris's policies are going to be the same as Biden's, and you should suck it up. You need to suck it up. How this was supposed to win votes is totally lost on me. And then, as you said, you combine that with Kamala Harris going out of her way to, even as she declined to do things like go on podcasts like Joe Rogan, and she had like the least number of media interviews of any, and Joe Biden as well, like aggressively avoided the media. Meanwhile, she's going out of her way to court some of the people who are responsible for, like she got, as you said, not just Liz Cheney, but a lot of the neocons, people who should have, like, in my opinion, who should have been prosecuted for violating international laws and rules and norms, let alone the fact that they're still running free and influencing U.S. policy is itself a kind of terrible thing. But the fact that these are the people that she's going out hat in hand, seeking endorsements for, bragging about the endorsements for, while she kind of insists on doubling and tripling down on this set of policies in the Middle East that a lot of Americans were apprehensive about. Again, I can't. I'm a pretty creative person, but as I'm trying to kind of think through what is the strategy, as you said, who is this for? Who is this supposed to appeal to exactly? Even on the Republican side, a lot of these figures were deeply unpopular. These neocon figures. I mean, part of the reason Trump won is because these neocon figures were deeply unpopular in the Republican Party. Yeah. His nomination and his successful nomination and then his victory in 2016 was a repudiation of these people on the Republican side. So there's not even a base. There's no base for these people. There's no constituency for these people outside of Washington. And so it's I don't get it. But it was clearly a colossal series of errors, both in terms of the Biden administration in the first place, enabling this situation to spiral out of control when it was within their capacity to exert pressure. We do have this kind of leverage if we chose to exercise it. I wish that Trump exercised it differently, better, whatever. But the fact that he's exercising it at all is something that the Biden administration was not doing. One of the things that I've despaired about for a while is that, like the 2016 election, the fact that the Democrats lost to one of the most unpopular candidates on the other side that's ever ran, in part because they also appointed a super unpopular candidate who ran a pretty terrible campaign, like is an indictment. But rather than learning much from that election, Democrats spent most of the intervening 4 years, instead of thinking, well, what did we do wrong? How can we do better? They spent most of the time going, well, what's wrong with the voters? Let's why didn't we win? It's because the voters are too stupid. They're too racist. They're too sexist. They're too authoritarian, rather than going, well, what's wrong with our party and platform and messaging? And so they managed to squeak out a narrow win in 2020, in part because of COVID and the chaos around that. But nothing was learned. Nothing was learned. And so the kind of campaign that Biden and later Kamala Harris ran in 2024 was like a 2016 redux in many ways, and it had the same outcome. And I wonder, and again, I have a lot of apprehension as it relates to 2028 about kind of who they nominate, what their foreign policy looks like. I don't think a lot has been learned, and if I were to wager, it seems like the Democrat establishment, as it's currently structured, is all about more forever wars, all about more interventions. Hasn't learned a lot, and this is distressing to me.
And I think you're not alone. Viewed from the outside as well, the signs aren't good. As you said, we'll have to wait and see, but it is pretty grim. But we are so grateful for your analysis and your time. So thank you so much, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your time in Australia, despite the grim outlook for States.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. Thank you. If you want to read more from the Australia Institute, you can pre-order the second edition in our Vantage Point series. Dead Centre: How Political Pragmatism is Killing Us by Richard Dennis argues that the quest for the sensible centre in Australian politics is pointless and flies in the face of evidence. You can pre-order it now for $19.95 or become a subscriber to the Vantage Point series via our website, australiainstitute.org.au/store, or tap the link in the show notes. If you want to hear more from Musa and me, we also had a conversation with Alex Sloane in Canberra in July. The recording is up on our website and linked in the show notes. And we'd love to get your thoughts on the show so far. You can send us feedback as well as episode and guest ideas to our email address, which is podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. This discussion with Musa was recorded on Wednesday the 9th of July. After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation and produced by Angus Blackman. We'll be back next week. I'm Emma Shortis. Thanks for listening.